Greetings. Welcome to the second lecture in Sealaska Heritage series celebrating Native American Heritage Month. My name is Chuck Smythe and I'm the Director of the Culture and History Department at Sealaska Heritage Institute. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you're interested in making a donation to the arts campus or submitting a letter of support to the Juneau Assembly for city funding, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. The title of today's lecture is Values, Tenure, and Organization: Critical Dimensions of Sustainable Development in Indigenous Southeast Alaska by Dr. Thomas F. Thornton. Dr. Thornton has graciously agreed to answer questions at the end of his presentations. Please write your questions in the chat box on YouTube. Dr. Thornton is the Dean of Arts and Sciences and Vice Provost for Research and Sponsored Programs at the University of Alaska Southeast, and Senior Research Fellow at the Environmental Change Institute, School of Geography and the Environment, University of Oxford. His research interests include indigenous and local knowledge systems and human-environmental interactions, the political ecology of sustainable development and resource stewardship in complex social ecological systems, and human adaptation to environmental change in the North Pacific, especially Southeast Alaska. One of his recent research reports is a book that he wrote based on research he conducted for us. I thought I would be able to show it here. Here it is, entitled The Distribution of Subsistence Herring Eggs in Alaska from Sitka Sound. So I encourage you to look at this book, which is available through Amazon.com. Dr. Thornton, thank you for your talk, and we'll look forward to it.
Well, geez, thank you, Chuck. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and thank you for the invitation from Sealaska Heritage Institute. And I look like I'm coming from outside on the shores of Auk Lake, where our university sits on the traditional territory of the Occoquan, but I'm actually not there today. I'm in a kind of a small bedroom office projecting, so slightly more comfortable than being on the dock at Auk Bay. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about really some research I did back in 2008 till about 2012, and then have picked it up here and there since. And there we go. I hope my screen is sharing. And so it's not recent research, although I've taken the opportunity of doing this lecture to kind of update myself. And one of the things I'm kind of excited about, but also it makes it a little daunting, is just how much the landscape has changed, particularly around Alaska Native corporations. And but the main issues and the main thrust of what I want to say is actually maybe emboldened by what's happened, in that I think a lot of Alaska Native corporations have moved in the direction of sustainability and sustainable development in ways that are really exciting and encouraging. But I want to come at it from a distinctly anthropological angle and talk about value, tenures, and organization as being critical dimensions of sustainable development, and ones that are not always widely recognized. And with that, I will start advancing slides if everybody can see them. Ooh, it's not letting me advance. Let's try it that way. Okay. So a little bit about ANCSA. The famous Section 2B paragraph there about just what ANCSA was all about, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. And I think a lot of you probably who are attending this lecture are familiar with it, but I've just underlined a couple of things that I think are often emphasized. One, it was supposed to be a fair and just settlement of all claims of Alaska Natives and Native groups in Alaska, based on Aboriginal land claims. And the second, that it was supposed to address their quote unquote real economic and social needs, okay? And then the rest is also very important, but it's not going to be as instrumental in my talk about not wanting to create any permanent racially defined rights, institutions, obligations, etc. But what I want to emphasize is that ANCSA was not just a land settlement, but also a settlement of tenure, a strong statement on values, and a settlement on organization. And these things are not always emphasized, or at least not from an anthropological view. And I also want to stress the kind of contrast between development, which was considered to be an imperative in 1971, and sustainable development, which was kind of just coming into the fore as an intellectual idea, really in the early 1970s, when they began to talk about the limits of growth, and then later the Millennial Development Goals, and later the Sustainability Development Goals, or the Sustainable Development Goals. And so most of you know, I think, that it became necessary partly because of issues with the sustainability of ANCSA and ANCSA corporations to fix it. And so there have been several big pushes to fix certain things about ANCSA, and lots of little ones. The biggest one being the 1991 amendments, which made it not requisite that stocks could become alienable. And of course, the big thing that happened in Southeast was the fixing of the lack of land conveyance, or the full land conveyance of ANCSA in the 1971 Act. So an interesting statement was made by the late Byron Malott in connection with the Sealaska bill to fix that land conveyance issue and get the full land that Sealaska was entitled to under ANCSA. And he used a metaphor which is often used to describe ANCSA corporations, and that is the metaphor of the tool. And as we know in anthropological studies, a tool is not a neutral object, right? It always has someone wielding it, and it often has a context in which it's to be used. And that context can be incredibly complex. So I want to play with this idea of the tool a little bit, but he calls it a tool with a history, and it's the engine of capitalism. And then he goes on to say, and you don't mess with capitalism very much before a lot of things start falling on you. And that's an interesting statement to keep in mind. Now, lots of ways you can look at ANCSA and its success in terms of economic development. You'd need more indicators in terms of sustainable development. But one set of statistics makes the act look very good, and that's if you look at among states with a population of higher than 100,000 American Indians or Alaska Natives, how have they done in terms of percentage of Indigenous owned firms or state income? And Alaska tops the tables in both of those areas, at least according to the most recent census, which I guess will be updated in a couple of years. And so as economic indicators, but also as ownership of small business, which is maybe more than an economic indicator, it's a bigger stake in the economy. Alaska seems to have done very well. And we know that Alaska Native corporations are a big part of that because there are more than 200 of them. And of course, they're Native owned. But what I want to propose is three propositions about what I'm calling three tools of sustainable development, which have kind of come to the fore since 1971. And I think Sealaska, and I'll focus on Sealaska just because it's the most interesting example and the one this audience probably knows best. Three tools that I think are often underemphasized in sustainable development. And the first one is values. So we can define values as a way of right, the right way of doing things. And the proposition here is that values without tenure for sustaining them are like vehicles, tools, vehicles, whatever, without a right of way. The second proposition is concerning tenure, which we can think of as a set of environmental prerogatives in this case. But tenure without a sustainable organization is like a vehicle without power. And then finally, with respect to organizations, which we can think of as purposeful associations among people, from the Latin organon or tool, organizations without sustainability values are like vehicles without a navigation system. So, and I have this quote here from current Sealaska Board Chair Joe Nelson, my old colleague at UAS, which I think is interesting in this light because he talks about Sealaska as being a local company that is on a mission to make a positive impact globally. And he says today our ancient values, our connection to place, which could be considered tenure, and our collective identity, which could be considered organization, are driving our profits, our partnerships, again, an organizational term, and decisions. So all of these things are encompassed in various ways in, if you look at what Sealaska is talking about in terms of their strategy and their business plans, it's all there. And I think a lot of other corporations have moved in this direction as well. Whereas in 2008 to 2012, when we were looking at things like corporate mission statements, it was a little bit more ambiguous. A lot of them wanted to sustain economic growth, but we're not talking about culture. Some wanted to sustain cultural values as well as livelihoods, a whole range of different ideas, but not as central to many corporations' missions, at least explicitly. Now, it's worth thinking about from an anthropological standpoint, where do sustainability values originate? And I think they have multiple sources. One is, of course, the nature of life itself as involving sustaining connections and exchanges within a web of relations with our natural world. A second source could be the evolutionary imperative to perpetuate life. You know, we reproduce to sustain our own genealogies and so forth. A third is cultural knowledge, values, and practice, particularly adaptive learning that goes on over generations to facilitate and sustain those relationships that we value over time. And then on the Northwest Coast, you have some interesting notions of sustainability that have appeared in the literature. One was featured in a book called Keeping It Living, which was about really the cultivation and sustainment of plants by peoples of the Northwest Coast region, including Tlingit, but going all the way down to the southern Northwest Coast, where people have a notion essentially of cultivation. We often speak of the Northwest Coast as hunting, gathering, and fishers, but there's also a high degree of plant cultivation that goes on. It's not agriculture per se, but it's very similar kinds of techniques. And a good way to refer to it is sustainability. And so this idea of keeping plants living through various interventions is very much the focus of that book. And then myself, one time during this Alaska Native Corporation study, I asked the late Clarence Jackson, who was a member of the Sealaska board, how he would define sustainability. And I asked him in the Ketchikan airport, and he didn't answer me until Seattle. And then when he got off the plane, he said, "Wuch itik." and defined that as keeping them growing behind each other or replacing each other, which is a very similar idea to keeping it living. So an emphasis on growth and regrowth. And then, of course, you have more international global definitions that have gained credence. One is from a commission that was a Blue Ribbon Commission to look at the concept of sustainable development, the Brundtland Commission, that defined it as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And then you have, I think, the frame that a lot of corporations have been adopting, the so-called triple bottom line of social, environmental, and economic sustainability. And you can add a quadruple bottom line if you want to put culture as separate from social. So this is also a very common framework. Okay, and then here's a quick look at the global sustainability agenda. So this is a framework that was developed by the United Nations that I think most people in the US are not familiar with, but basically almost every nation in the world agreed to these goals as being worthy goals to strive for to improve the world situation by 2030. And they were adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2016. So we're 4 years into this and making some progress, but certainly not enough. But there are 17 goals and 169 targets behind each one for how they can be actualized. And to my mind, this is a useful framework because it's very broad. It deals with what might be considered universal values, but it's a bit careful in that sense of valuing people, planet, and prosperity. And it's clear at the marquee level of what we want to sustain, but it also tries to get into the nitty-gritty with these targets and also allow for some diversity in how you achieve your goals. So in that sense, it can be part of that global agenda that Joe Nelson was referring to. Now, a little bit, and of course, it has those values. And I want to say something about values in general, because there's been a lot of debate in recent years about what capitalism and particularly market values have done to maybe more traditional values or moral values. And a couple of books I've put on the side there. One of them, What Money Can't Buy, by Michael Sandel, the famous Harvard philosopher, criticizes trying to do things on the basis of what the market determines. And the reasons are several. One, that moral values and market values are simply incommensurable. And you cannot convert market values into something else. They're not fungible, and they're held collectively within society. A second idea is that market values lead to a crowding out of moral sentiments, sentiments that motivate people to produce public goods, to engage in collective action, to act sustainably, and so forth. A third idea is that market reason can overtake and debase mutuality on which society ultimately depends. As Stephen Goodman has written on that, the economic anthropologist. And then finally, when we look at indigenous moral values, they're often emplaced within a local socio-ecological system, in a kind of moral ecology of how plants, animals, other elements of that system should be treated. And David Korten wrote a book early on as a critique of the corporation as being an institution that was really promoting these market values at the expense of sustainability. And his book is called When Corporations Rule the World. And he said, what we need is to reestablish a sustainable relationship to living Earth, or to reestablish a sustainable relationship to living Earth, we must break free of the illusions of the world of money, rediscover spiritual meaning in our lives, and root our economic institutions in place and community so that they are integrally connected to people and life. So that's how he defines what a sustainable relationship can be for a corporation or in any economic institution. Okay. All right. So when I look at the development of what's happened at Sealaska, I see a lot of parallels to this. The development of a set of values and an actualization of those values in operating goals is a very exciting development. If you've read books like Sandel's or Corton's, or read The Anthropology of Economy, like Stephen Goodman's book. And so they put these values out there, and I think most of, if you're a shareholder, you've seen these. If not, there are 4. I don't know if you can read this slide. It's been tiny on my screen, but the first one is Ha'ani, our land, as being the basis of collective identity and important to sustaining relationships and for future generations, communities. The second, Ha'shuka, our past, present, and future. Again, critical to collective identity, but also to the inheritance and maintenance and sustainment of benefits, financial, social, environmental. Ha'latzin, our strength, our leadership. So the importance of values at the top, and maybe being strong and disciplined and resilient in maintaining your values and your health and well-being. And then finally, wuchak, balance, reciprocity, and respect. And that really is, I would say, a better explication or a fuller explication of what Goodman calls mutuality, the concepts of balance and reciprocity and interdependence. So I guess the question becomes then, can embedding your core sustainability values in your business model overcome the perils of so-called market values, which we were just critiquing, to create sustainable communities? And I've put that sustainable development goal in here because that's what you see over and over again in Sealaska's values in action. They want to have a corporation that creates and supports sustainable communities. So even though they're not deliberate, I put that goal there, they didn't. They're certainly attending to it in their own way. Now, moving on from values to tenure, this is one I think that is so important, and it's often lost, because if you come into Alaska and you say, what are Alaska Native corporations? You might see a map like this. And I'm not criticizing my colleague Gary Holton for producing this map, because it is one of the few maps that overlays Alaska Native corporations onto traditional ethno-linguistic areas that existed. And as a linguist, that's a very interesting exercise to do. And you see that there's a relatively good fit between the regional corporations' boundaries and those of the major ethno-linguistic groups. It's not perfect. And of course, you have groups that are combined, including here in Southeast Alaska. But it's not bad. There was an attempt there to not to be arbitrary, but to make the corporations and their general boundaries fit the biocultural regions which had evolved on the land. But it's deceptive for this reason. That land is not all owned. And then when you get this DNR map that I've reproduced here, it looks a bit fuzzy, but you don't really need to see the details. What you see is essentially there's a lot of different landowners throughout the state, and the orange color there in the middle actually is what represents land that was conveyed through ANCSA. And you can see it's a tiny fraction of the total land base, and a tiny fraction of any corporation's land base within the boundaries as represented on the previous map. And of course, in Southeast Alaska, you can hardly see any orange at all, because the total land base was just not even 400,000 acres within the Tongass, and that's less than 2%, I believe. So So it's deceptive. But obviously we know tenure is important, right? Because if you want to be able to exercise full rights as a corporation or as a family or an entity, you have to have some tenure. You have to have some tenure security. And then if we look at the map of tribes, we see that they're typically represented without a land base as just their villages, because tribes in most cases don't have a land base, or at least not one that was conveyed unless they were a reservation or they got their lands back from the corporations after ANCSA or as part of the ANCSA agreement. Otherwise, the tribes only have lands that they might have acquired through their own purchase. And so you see the absence of land tenure in tribes, and that's an issue for their development and sustainability. Okay, when we think about tenure, it's useful to think about it in terms of security and insecurity. But tenure tends to arise in societies as a way of regulating access, use, transfer, and responsibility to places that people claim or hold interest in, or resources. Tenure systems are often complex or overlapping, and they're only secure really if they're enforceable and if they produce relatively predictable, if not stable, outcomes in regulating resources. And then third, tenure insecurity is really a combination of objective and subjective conditions which threaten people's claims and relationships to land and resource bases. And those things concern whether or not resources will or will not remain available in a certain quantity or quality. That's a lot of what's behind the herring egg issue that is discussed in the book Chuck mentioned. Whether people will or will not be able to maintain present use patterns, customary and traditional use, as it were, and whether the distribution of rights and benefits accrued from places are or are not being distributed and regulated equitably among land users, okay? Or in the case of Native corporations, among shareholders or Alaska Natives. And then finally, why is tenure important? Well, it's hypothesized, at least, and there's certainly some evidence to support it, that without tenure security, you can't have proper stewardship of resources, and you won't have proper investments in sustainability. But there's also the co-benefits to tenure systems that they can increase social cohesion and reduce conflicts. Good fences make good neighbors, right, is one idea. Empirical studies from across countries also confirm that tenure insecurity is highly correlated with resource degradation, such as deforestation. And then in the oceans, we know the crisis of ocean fishing and pollution suggests that there's a lack of enforceable tenure schemes contributing to these problems. Now, I bring this up partly because one of the most important aspects of ANCSA was the fact that it did away with any Aboriginal claims to marine rights and waters, along with any Aboriginal land claims and hunting and fishing rights. But the marine tenure insecurity that arose from it is significant, and it's commented on repeatedly in the record. And of course, one of the reasons for being of a new organization that arose within an already complex socio-political organization in Southeast Alaska, that organization being the Alaska Native Brotherhood and the Alaska Native Sisterhood, was to deal with tenure insecurity and sustainability issues surrounding fisheries, specifically to get rid of fish traps. And even before they filed the land claim suit, you had resolutions coming out of A&B protesting issues with tenure and sustainability. And so here's one from Icy Straits, which I think is very prescient and worth reading. But it says here, Icy Straits District is the most important to the northern spawning districts. The tides are so swift and strong that it's only possible for seine fishermen to operate for a short time during slack water. If it were not for the fish traps, salmon would have almost continuous free passage to the spawning grounds. But this summer, 14 traps were located from Three Hill Island to the inside end of Indian Island, which completely blocked the narrow passage into the straits. In the interest of the whole fishing industry, this area should be entirely closed to traps, which by their location and efficiency lay tribute to almost 100% of the fish that are trying to get to their spawning grounds. Okay, so here's a clear statement on an insecure system, an unsustainable system, and one which threatened their own security. But interestingly, what you get from this is probably the Huna delegation that's formulating this, is that they have an ecosystem view of the fishery already. They know that this is a critical passage. They know that for all fishermen in the inside waters to have sustainable livelihoods as fishermen, they need these fish to have free passage, or at least a lot more than 100% being cut off, a lot less than 100% being cut off. And they had fished these areas very successfully for years. And the other thing that's interesting is that they're not just concerned about their own tenure, but that actually of their whole sector or their whole industry. And so the sustainability values we've been addressing are really already there. And what's unfortunate is that it took another, 25 years plus to get rid of the fish traps. And then eventually by 1971, the whole Icy Straits was closed. And that, of course, had a tremendous impact on the livelihoods of commercial fishermen from Huna and other areas. But even more astonishing is what happened to fishing rights as a result of some litigation having to do with the Statehood Act, because as you know, the state got management over navigable waters. But the reasoning concerning tenure is quite torturous and again, worth considering. And I'll just read that middle paragraph. It says, unless we conclude, which we do not, that the Indians owned the right to remove all fish and therefore owned all of the fish, there is no compensable value lost when others fish in the area. There is no aboriginal right based on occupancy and use, which gives the plaintiffs title to the fish or an exclusive right to remove fish. We hold, therefore, that the value of the fisheries did not enhance the value of the land, and therefore it is not properly includable in the computation value for the land. I mean, a really astonishing statement, which goes against every study that's ever been done about why groups flourished in the Northwest Coast or in Southeast Alaska. The value of the land was totally enhanced by the marine resources, and they were really inseparable. So that's a major issue for the sustainability of an organization when they lose what is the primary value of the land. And so that's led to a number of issues, and of course, where Alaska Native corporations did get land, in the case of Southeast, it was usually land-based resources that they were left to pursue. And of course, timber was the one in Southeast Alaska. I'm going to move on now to talk about the third aspect here, organization. And here I want to sort of build on an idea which has intrigued me for a long time, which is basically the organizational complexity of the Southeast Alaska Native landscape and the Alaska Native landscape in general. But it's fair to say that Alaska Natives are hyper-organized in a way. They have traditional indigenous organizational forms, clan, house group, and so on. They have new imposed forms, such as the IRA tribes and the ANCSA corporations. And then they have new indigenous organizational forms, such as A&B and AFN, the Alaska Federation of Natives. And then, of course, there are national and international organizations as well. So when you have this kind of organizational proliferation, this expanding of organizations where there's lots of addition and not much subtraction, it creates, I would argue, a sustainability challenge, because you end up with different organizations competing for funding, for tenure, for a say in various issues, and so on. And it can also lead to a phenomenon called involution, where instead of evolving more steadily, you're just sort of growing in on yourselves and not necessarily working together. And I wrote about this not as a reality, but as a potential threat back in 2002, and this is from an article in the Alaska Review, which looked at this issue of from clan to quan to corporation, about how you build all of these different layers of organization. And already on the Northwest Coast, and arguably in Southeast Alaska, you had some of the most complex social political organizations, at least 6 levels. If you talk about the person, him or herself, as being a level of social organization, getting a name, for example, that belonged to somebody else, having membership in a house group with a clan, being part of a quan, as well as a moiety, and then within a nation. That's half a dozen layers right there. And then you're adding on these additional ones without, as I said, much subtraction. So, and I've not even included all of them in there. There are lots more that could be included today. So that's what I mean by hyper-organized and proliferated in terms of organization. And what does that mean? And I certainly think, if you look at this Chehalis case that Chris McNeil discussed the other day, one way to look at it is that it is a competition that's developed between organizations on this playing field over what might be perceived as limited resources under the CARES Act or whatever it was. Okay, and then I'll show this map again, just in terms of organizations. It's too small to read, but I couldn't figure out a way to blow it up. But again, it shows the tiny amount of land that is conveyed to native corporations as opposed to other landholders here. But it also shows, which is worth commenting on, that not every corporation's land is in its traditional territory, in its quan territory. Some had to choose for various reasons outside of their traditional territory, which also created, in some cases, conflict and competition for resources. So that's both a tenure issue and an organizational issue. Okay, moving ahead then, coming back to the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the questions is, these are lovely, these are aspirational, but how do we achieve them? And people have different views about how to achieve sustainability. And a lot of what you see, and this is just one view here that's coming out of an organization called The World in 2050, of how you get to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals with prosperity, social inclusion, and sustainability. A lot of them lean heavily on technology, okay, like you see here, the digital revolution up in the left-hand corner there, artificial intelligence, big data, biotech, so forth, or things like intensification of agriculture through technology, smart cities, which are enhanced by technology, and so forth. But you don't actually get that much about values, and you don't get that much about tenure, and you don't get that much about even organization. I mean, I think it's implicit in some of these, but it's not explicit. And to me, that's interesting, because I think in many cases, the assumptions are ethnocentric, that everyone shares the same values around these things, that the tenure really belongs with the state, or maybe with the UN, as opposed to local communities, and that the organizational structure is really through states and cities and big organizations. Although if you challenge them, they will say, no, there's room for everybody. Okay, so I actually like, if I were to put the sustainability ideas down on Alaska Native corporate organization, I would find that they work better according to what I've been outlining in terms of these three dimensions of sustainability. So here's one, a community development spinoff from Sealaska called Spruce Root that's focused on community development and outlines as its goals community, economy, environment, partnership, and collaboration. And that touches on a number of sustainable development goals, as does its mission, how it works to build capacity, grow the economic strength by increasing education capacity, technical resources, mentoring, and so on. But they also emphasize the importance of collaboration and partnerships, which is another one of the sustainable development goals. And it's one that's very important, I think, when we think about organizations. I think if we've learned anything in the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, large-scale organizations like the UN cannot implement goals on their own. And even states have failed pretty miserably in implementing most sustainability goals. In fact, you could argue that states were created largely to overcome their own unsustainability. In other words, they needed a military or a bureaucracy to somehow help them acquire more resources through warfare or trade in order to keep going with their current patterns of living. And so it may be up to innovative new organizations and lots of partnerships and collaborations in order to really achieve sustainability. Okay, and here's another thing I did just for fun, is looking at, again, Sealaska's businesses, and just going by what they say on their website, because this is me kind of updating some earlier research and trying to map what they say onto the sustainable development goals. So first of all, they say we serve the twin goals of economic prosperity and environmental protection, which is only a double bottom line as opposed to a triple or quadruple. But if you look at what they're doing in their core businesses, they've got natural resource and land management, environmental services, and sustainable foods here on the right-hand side, and the missions of each of those in terms of what they're trying to do. And so this the first one, to improve air and water quality, we sustainably manage our forests, including preserving nearly half our forested lands as part of our carbon offsets program. That's very consistent with obviously the goals for climate action in mitigating greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, and as well as other sustainable development goals. So I put 3 up there, which is good health and well-being, 6, which is clean water and sanitation, 13, which is climate action, and 14, life below water, as well as life on land. Then the second one, environmental services, to protect, second one, to protect fisheries, our seafood companies, which is sustainable seafoods, actively support sustainable fishing and seek more value per fish through innovative practices. Okay, and that's one of number 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. And then finally, the environmental services to improve the health of streams, waterways, through water testing for water quality, solving complex hydrology challenges, etc. So that would be 6, at least 6, and perhaps 14 as well. So interesting how well they do just on a sample mapping. But of course, I'm not measuring the success of these. I'm simply aligning their missions with the Sustainable Development Goals. And another one, this is from a few years ago, but represents a really important sustainable development goal. Some people would say the most important, because you'll never get there on climate, you'll never get there on well-being, you'll never get there on economic prosperity if you don't have a sustainable energy system. And so we find Sealaska and many other Alaska Native corporations, particularly in rural areas, trying to boost renewable energy, really to lower their energy costs, but also to be more sustainable, if not climate friendly. And so this is an example from Huna, which was installed with partly with financing from Sealaska. Okay. All right. So concluding then, I wanted to talk about alignment and introduce one more sustainable development goal to you. But alignment is really important. A corporation can have values, or another entity can have values. It may or may not have tenure, or it may be well organized for its purposes. But if it doesn't have all three of these things aligned somehow, I think it's difficult to achieve sustainability. And the wonderful thing about Southeast Alaska is you have particularly a social organization, an economic organization, a political organization that was very flexible, very scalable. You can think about from the individual to the house group, to the matrilineal clan, to the moiety as being one segmentable super lineage for achieving things organizationally on a lot of levels. That is probably close to the kind of organization we need, maybe more so than the traditional Westphalian state, to achieve our sustainability goals. But unfortunately, that organization was majorly disrupted, of course, by colonization. But even the so-called just solutions, ANCSA included, have been disruptive too, because they haven't really been attentive to aligning these values, tenure, and organization in a coordinated way. But yet these things are really important to achieving the sustainable development goals. And no one organization can do it all. There's just too much to do. And too many disconnected organizations in the same space can certainly backfire. So complementary partnerships are essential. And in preparing this lecture, something I've thought about is what is the role of the university? What should be the role of the University of Alaska in this endeavor? And I became interested in the Sustainable Development Goals through my own research, separate from looking at Alaska Native corporations, but in looking at climate adaptation. And I became interested in the fact that there are networks that have developed on the country level to innovate and provide solutions to particularly the most unsustainable problems that we face, whether it's global warming or deterioration of forests or water quality, what have you. And I think universities have a big role to play in this. And we were invited to join something called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network as the University of Alaska. And I volunteered to be the representative because I think universities should be partners in this effort, and that we as organizations also need to better align our educational values, of which sustainability is one explicitly at UAS, our own tenure, and our tenure is not so much over land, but really over credentialing, degrees and certificates and so on, and our organization as a public university towards critical regional and global sustainable development goals. And to me, that means increasing collaborations with Alaska Native tribes and corporations and other public and private partners to get to work on these goals, essentially. And we all know that the state's having a funding crisis, or at least if you're dealing with the University of Alaska budget, you're very aware of it. But if you think about why we are where we are, I think it's because we haven't been really attentive enough to sustainable development. Even though it's in the Alaska Constitution, it's baked right in there, we haven't been attentive to it. We got lucky with oil development and we threw a lot of our eggs in that basket. And now we know we need to diversify, but that means we have to accelerate the process of getting to the sustainable development goals. And But I think if we do, and if we follow this formula and particularly develop these partnerships, we can move ahead and get out of what is now 43rd place in the rankings among sustainable development USA states. As of 2018, Alaska ranked 43rd out of 50 states in sustainability, and rise to the top where we belong, given the constitutional mandate we have for sustainable development and the capacity we have as a state, both in terms of our natural capital, but also our human capital, to keep it living, as it were. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That's very, very interesting and broad scope of a lecture. Appreciate that. We will now take questions which have been submitted via YouTube. We have one question. Can you comment on tenure insecurity that is challenged by the effects of climate change and restricted access and use of public conservation lands in Southeast Alaska?
Yes, I think that's a big issue. So if you have a tenure system, it probably also has to be flexible, right? Because environments change. And I think we face that now. I mean, we look at the Mendenhall wetlands, for example. They're rising each year. There's a change there, and if you're a landholder there, the boundaries of your property is in terms of its wetland versus dry lands is changing every year because the glacier is still rebounding. In other places, the sea level rise is greater than any rebound, and so you see flooding and loss of land. In other cases, you have ocean acidification, or you have other environmental changes that are going to change resource supply or limit access. So I think tenure systems have to be flexible about that. And of course, if we look at the history of tenure, it changes, right? It changes for all kinds of reasons. Property becomes not worth defending. People compete and fight over it, whatever, and the jurisdiction changes. But I would say the environmental changes are dwarfed by the social and political changes that have affected tenure, particularly among Alaska Native communities. And that's why I focused on marine tenure, because it's just wiped out. You know, it just doesn't exist anymore. And I think one question is, if Sealaska or any corporation or tribe wants to get into seafood, how do they reestablish tenure, right? At a subsistence level, you can say we have tenure through customary and traditional use, right? But that's not a hard tenure. It's often not strictly tied to glacial boundaries, but to stocks or presumed stocks of fish or other resources. So that is a kind of a weak tenure that's under ANILCA and the subsistence law, and it's really circumscribed from any commercial interest. So if you want to pursue seafoods commercially, you have to do it through permits and other things. And now we're at a situation in Southeast Alaska, which is very interesting because you have, say, mariculture. You've got permitting going on for large mariculture projects. And we know that some of those projects are sitting in traditional waters that were used by various Alaska Native groups around the region. But that tenure is gone, but now it's being reinitiated through a permit system. And it's the same thing that happened with fishing. The commercial fishing rights and Aboriginal fishing rights ended up being taken away, but then reintroduced as limited rights through permits and limited entry. And so those changes and effects on tenure have been huge. And, you know, it's led to a lot of permits leaving Alaska Native villages throughout the states, but also other changes. And I would say at this point, those changes probably outweigh any of the climatic or environmental changes, except where there's been, development or degradation very directly on lands or natural disasters.
Well, thank you. We have another question. What is the largest factor that led Alaska to its low sustainability ranking, given it has robust aquaculture, forest management, and preservation of 100 million of acres across the state?
Well, that's a good question. We do very well in natural, as I said, in the areas around natural capital. So clean air, clean water, and those kinds of things. Forests, we do well. We don't do as well in areas like education, gender equality, I think was okay. Inequality, and what was the other? Well, and the fact that we're very dependent on oil. So I think 43rd, we were ahead of Louisiana, which is another big oil state. I think Louisiana might be 49th or 50th, but generally, if you were a big oil state or a big hydrocarbon state, you were far down on the list because of the imperatives around climate action and renewable energy and that sort of thing. But I encourage you can find the index yourself online, and you can also Google in the Juneau Empire. I wrote a little thing about how Alaska should be embarrassed about its status as 43rd rank on the Sustainable Development rankings for states in the Juneau Empire. I think it was in 2018. But there's a link in there which goes to the report, and you can look. They had a tough job because they wanted to come up with indicators that would be roughly comparable across all 50 states. And that was very difficult to do. So they did the best they could and came up with these rankings, but they're all made explicit in the document.
Another question has to do with the issue of alignment you were talking about, and challenges to that by COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm thinking of fragmentation of organizations, as you see in the Chehalis case. But I'm also thinking of the issue of subsistence. And for example, in Cake, where there was an emergency provision allowed by the feds to permit the Cake people to hunt deer out of season, to hunt deer and provide needed resources for the village. But that was challenged by the state, and it's still in court, as I understand it. It's still under active challenge and seeking to discredit that and eliminate that. So what, do you have any comments on that? I mean, when you have this external, factor coming in?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a direct result of ANCSA, the fact that they couldn't do that without state permission, right? That's the abolishment or extinguishment of Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights. And so what you have in its place is essentially a system of exceptionalisms. So exceptionally, you can sometimes get a permit for an emergency or for a cultural event or something to hunt or fish. And I guess if it's a life-threatening thing, you're supposed to have that right as an individual. But as an organization, yeah, they have to apply to the state. And states are very worried about legal precedents, especially ones that might be tied to particular groups or races or whatever. So I think that's the point behind the litigation, more so than there's not enough moose or other resource to go around. But I think that's a great tenure example of how really, how responsive can the state be as an organization when you apply and you have to go through this situation where they have tenure, there's legal rights, there's case law, whatever, and you just need to get your food because you're cut off. I think that was partly due to COVID, but also maybe partly due to the stress of the ferry system not delivering food in a timely manner. So you have these exceptions, but the exceptions are granted by the state. I mean, I think the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is a federal law, is another good example of that. But it's a lot more liberal. So you don't have to apply every time you want to kill a seal or a whale, but you have to follow just the basic prescription that you're doing it, living in a community as a native person who's historically dependent on that resource and not using it for commercial purposes or wanton waste or whatever the language is. So yeah, exceptional. That's what we rely on now is exceptionalism being granted by the state, the federal government or the state government to carry out those things. And I think that's dubious because it tends to be not that responsive in many cases.
Alrighty, one final comment here, and I don't know if you have a comment on it. It says, note that Southeast Alaska Natives sought both tribes through the A&B efforts to secure the 1936 amendments to the IRA and corporations through ANCSA in order to control their land base.
Yeah.
Thus, it is not accurate to say that they were imposed, but that they were sought actively, proactively by Southeast natives.
I'm not sure I understand the first part of the comment then.
Well, I think it's a comment that that Southeast natives were proactive in seeking to secure the 1936 amendments to IRA, which extended that act.
Extended. Oh, I see. Yeah. But I guess I think that's true. And it's no question it's true. But I think that the IRA is a reorganization done to Native tribes. So you had to come up with a constitution, right, that passed muster with the federal government. And it was certainly an improvement over the Allotment Act and lots of other federal Indian policy. But I would say it was as much the federal government organizing tribes as it was tribes organizing themselves for the federal government. I don't know. But it's not to say that people didn't want it, because it provided a real means to act communally that was lacking. And obviously it provided federal recognition, which has been a very, very important tool for tribes. So I didn't mean to imply that it wasn't.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thornton. This is a great lecture. Appreciate it. We'll add it to our YouTube website for additional viewers to benefit from it in the future. So we invite viewers to return for our next lecture by Dr. Edward K. Thomas, entitled A Review of Tribal Governments, which is tomorrow at noon. That had to be rescheduled from last week. We have a link below the video for a survey we hope you will take a moment to complete. This will help us to continue improving our lecture series and also allow our funders to measure the impact of the program. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus or submitting a letter of support to the Juneau Assembly for city funding, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. Thank you, and see you again tomorrow.